You're listening to Big World Network.
Just Kill Me, Season 3, Episode 9, Trevor's Cell. Written by Wendy Herman. Read by Wendy Herman. I don't know what I expected to find when I entered FBI headquarters, holding Freya's hand, her father trailing behind us, but it wasn't to be frisked and searched to the point of embarrassment. The guards at the entrance had been doubled since the day before, and it seemed that everyone was being considered a possible security threat, and several people without proper ID were being turned away. What had we missed while we were in Garrity? World War III? When I tried to lighten the mood by asking the guard why the TSA search was necessary, he ignored me, focusing on his very thorough search of my personage with a stone face. Eventually we were let through, and Freya's dad had even produced some identification card I didn't recognize that got him cleared without a strip search. I made a mental note to ask him about that later. One thing I did know was that there was a lot he wasn't telling us, and I could sense that Freya felt it too. We had been so in sync, her and I, since our unexpected reunion, that I felt exhilarated and more alive than ever. In fact, I had no idea a person could feel this good. Even with everything that was going on, I just couldn't be knocked off the cloud I was walking on. I had loved Freya my whole life, but had always known I could never have her. And then, bam! Suddenly she was mine again, and I was going to do anything and everything in my power to keep her. I couldn't tell her, but I was secretly delighted that Trevor may not be the father of her children. If what her father told us was true, then it just seemed to make the whole situation easier somehow. The only reason she had contemplated staying with the bastard was because of their children. If that reason was now off the table completely, then he had no claim whatsoever to her or her boys. I just had to know, how the hell had he done it? If he wasn't the father, then who was? And how on God's green earth had he managed to impregnate his wife with someone else's sperm? My head started to hurt when I thought about the possibilities. I clutched Freya's hand tighter as we made our way to the detention area in the basement. Trevor was still locked up and would remain so until we got some answers. I had spoken to Director Pixley briefly on the phone earlier that morning, and the FBI's newest prisoner hadn't given up any information yet, but he was growing more and more unstable by the hour. It was just a matter of time before he cracked, and I wanted to be there when he did. We approached the secure entrance to the detention area, and I turned to Freya. "Are you sure you want to go in?" I knew I didn't really have to ask, but I was worried the sight of him might be very confusing for her, considering what she'd been through in the last few days, and the past 2 decades. She smiled at me and nodded. I've never been more sure of anything. She was calm, and her confident gaze steadied my own heart rate. I silently hoped seeing him wouldn't freak me out, after learning what a diabolical son of a bitch he really was. He was the guy I had told my deepest, darkest secrets to, as much as men do, except for the one about loving his wife. That admission had been an accident, but I had loved him too, like a brother. Had he programmed that, or had it been real? We scanned our badges and were allowed entry, and once again Jerry's strange ID card garnered him immediate access as well. What the hell was that card of his? An FBI fast pass? I opened my mouth to ask him about it, but he suddenly spoke to the young guard. "What's with the body cavity search downstairs? Someone try to kill the president?" He chuckled at his own dangerous joke, but the guard just stared at him blankly for a second. Joking about killing the president at FBI headquarters was likened to saying the word bomb in an airport. I don't know, sir," he stuttered. "I've been down here since 0600. Now I was curious. "You didn't hear any alarms or anything?" "No, sir." I didn't have time to validate the sense of foreboding I was getting from the nervous guard, so I shook it off. "Are you new?" Freya asked the young man. Leave it to her to make friends. I smirked to myself and turned to the secure monitors that showed each of the 20 or so cells on the other side of the 12-inch thick lead door we were about to go through. As Freya chatted up the guard, I found Trevor's cell and froze for a second. What the hell? Trevor was curled up in a ball in the corner of his cell, barely visible in the shadows, but the audio was clear as a bell. He was crying. Crying? I'd known the man for 20 years, had considered him my best friend for most of that time, and I'd never seen him cry. Not once. I'd never thought how odd that was until now, that he was bawling like a newborn baby. Before I could prepare Freya for this new surprise, she was standing next to me, staring at the screen just as I had been doing, stunned at what she was witnessing. It's weird. I've never seen him cry. In 20 years, she said, trailing off. I turned to her. He never cried in front of you. Ever? She looked at me, her eyes growing more alive with every new revelation. That's strange, isn't it? He never cried, even when the boys were born. Before I could censor it, it came out. Well, if they aren't his, then I immediately regretted it. I gave her an apologetic look, but she didn't look angry. Her expression hardened, determined, and she pointed at the screen without breaking eye contact with me. That sad sack of a man is not my husband. Then she softened a bit, and her eyes sparkled with mischief. It's time for the puppet master to be trolled for a change. She walked to the door to the cells, and then glanced back at me to see if I was coming. Excellent, I whispered and joined her. I think I'll stay put, Jerry chimed in. I started at the sound of his voice behind me. I'd forgotten he was there. Freya had a way of making the rest of the world disappear when I was with her. She turned to him and nodded. Don't you think your experience with this kind of thing might make you useful in there? I was surprised he didn't want to go, but he just shrugged at me. I'll watch on the monitor. You don't need me in there. Plus, if he recognizes me, it might open a whole other can of worms. Fair enough, I commented, but gave him a look that said, we'll talk later. He just grinned at me like a schoolboy. He was enjoying himself, and it made me uneasy. Don't be long, though, he pointed a finger at us. I'm hungry. Freya cocked her head at him, and he shrugged at her, too. It was going to take a lot of patience to get any real answers out of Jerry McKenna, and I was dreading trying. I pushed the thought away and turned to the rookie guard, whose sole job was to protect the rest of the world from what was behind the door in front of us, and nodded. He punched in a code on the console next to the door, leaned in for an eye scan, placed his hand on the screen for a fingerprint ID, and then punched in another long code. We heard a loud click, and the door popped open a fraction of an inch. I opened it the rest of the way and led Freya down the maze of corridors to the end of the hall, hearing the door close with a loud thud behind us. Trevor's success at essentially hiding from the FBI within our own walls for 20 years had garnered him the special suite, reserved for those unique criminals that the government was, well, afraid of. The fact that he had worked on a sleeper assassin program when he was barely 20, and then married one of the assassins, after allegedly reprogramming her government-sanctioned implant for his own nefarious purposes, was troubling, to say the least. Add to that the fact that he had been a trusted agent, given the highest security clearance in the building, second only to the director himself, and the staggering amount of information he had been given access to, and it was enough to get him 50 years in the electric chair. As far as I was concerned, he was lucky he hadn't been sent to a mining colony on Mars, but I was still hopeful. Pixley had been hesitant to hold Trevor, only knowing what he'd been told by his boss, and his boss's boss, that Trevor had been assigned to watch Freya 20 years ago, and that the marriage had been part of the cover. If that were true, I would have to tell Freya. I hadn't mentioned it, frankly, because I'd forgotten about it temporarily. There had been a lot going on, after all. When I'd called Pixley on our way to headquarters, he'd been ready to release the bastard for lack of evidence, until I told him what we'd discovered in the past 24 hours. He was silent on the other end of the line as I told him everything. Well, I might have left out the part about Freya and me being together, but that was not his business as far as I could see. He agreed to keep Trevor locked up until we got there, but couldn't guarantee he could keep him unless we could get him to confess something, anything. I was sure I could get him to crack, and then he would never see the light of day again. As we stepped into an elevator at the end of the hall, and I pushed the arrow down button, I turned to Freya. There's something I need to tell you about what Pixley was told by the suits in D.C. The words came faster than I intended. What? She didn't look at me, so I continued. They say Trevor was given the assignment of watching you, indefinitely, and that the whole marriage thing was part of the cover. She was quiet for a moment, then sighed heavily. Well, that makes sense. Really? No, she sighed again. It does tell me that someone in Washington has been protecting him for 20 years for some reason. The question is, are they still? We'll figure all this out, I promise. She turned and gave me a sweet smile. You're taking it very well. At that, her smile vanished. I don't feel the same, Ty. I waited a second for her to continue, to clarify what she was talking about, but she seemed unable to find the words. What do you mean? 2 days ago, I was this person. I thought I knew exactly who I was, but I was living this half-life as Trevor's... She closed her eyes. I know it was just yesterday when we... She paused and smiled as if thinking about our first encounter. Then she opened them and looked into my eyes. I'm sorry. My point is, I'm Freya. For the first time in 20 years, I'm finally me again. She laughed and looked down at the floor, shaking her head. It's so strange. I really believed I had this picture-perfect life, but it's like I was locked inside a part of my own brain that you opened yesterday. She looked at me again and grinned at her unintentional pun. I felt my cheeks get hot. She was the only person on the planet who could make me blush. I keep thinking I should be devastated at the time I lost, being Trevor's puppet wife. All the time I could have been with you. But I refuse to let him dictate my emotions anymore. I'm just so happy to be whole again. For the most part, I feel relieved. She wrapped her arms around my neck, staring into my eyes with those chocolate pools of hers. I wanted nothing more than to kiss her 1,000,000 times, but the sound of a throat clearing loudly startled us both. We turned toward the elevator door and realized it had already opened. The guard was standing in the hallway, waiting for us to exit, appeared annoyed at our personal moment. He rolled his eyes as we released our hold of each other, and I guided Freya to step out of the elevator first. We had entered the sub-detention level. There was only one cell on this level, and it was currently occupied by the puppet master himself. Once the guard had called upstairs and spoken with his counterpart, and scrutinized our identification badges as if he were looking for clues left by the Freemasons, he turned to a keypad on the wall and typed in a code. The cell door in front of us buzzed and popped open. Inside was another door, this one with a small window. The guard did not enter with us, but punched in another code on the same pad in the hallway, and the second door buzzed. I took a deep breath and opened the door. Trevor was sitting up now, but still in the back corner of the small, otherwise empty room. He didn't look up when we entered, and we just stood there, staring at him for a few seconds. I haven't done anything wrong, he said softly as he raised his head. When he saw that it was Freya and me, his mouth fell open, and he made to stand. I immediately drew my weapon and trained it right at his head. Don't, Trevor. He put his hands in the air in surrender and sat back down on the floor. He looked terrible, his face revealing his earlier sob session, and his hair sticking up on end. The Trevor I knew would have been mortified if he'd seen himself in a mirror. He looked up at us, pleading. Rip, it's not what you think. You have to believe me. You're my best friend. I could never lie to you. You were never my friend. It was all some sick fantasy world you created. That's not true. Well, yes, it's partly true, but... Wait, you remember? Sure, Trevor, let's go with that. I didn't answer him. He turned to Freya, desperation filling his eyes. Frey, this is all a big mistake. Yes, Trevor, it is a mistake. Our marriage, our life, you. Don't say that, Freya. We have a great marriage. We didn't have a marriage. I was your prisoner. Freya, Trevor begged. You are my wife. We have 3 beautiful boys. You can't just throw all that away because you think you still love him, he said with contempt. I rolled my eyes. Him has a gun pointed at your head, moron. I waited for Freya to bring up the whole sterile thing, but she seemed to be avoiding it. I guess it was our Hail Mary play. How could you do this? Freya asked, but maintaining control of her emotions. How could you turn me into your live-in prostitute? All these years. Why me? Why did you have to steal my life? He closed his eyes tight at her words. They were clearly cutting him deep. I don't know what you're talking about, Frey. I love you. You love me. We fell in love and got married. We have 3 children that we raised together. We have the perfect life. Yes, we did. It was perfect, she agreed. He smiled as if he was getting through to her, but his imagined victory was short-lived. It was perfect because it wasn't real. He acted the tortured victim. How can you say our life together isn't real? We have a great marriage. You are a wonderful wife, and you've always told me what a good husband I am. I snorted quietly at his expression. Then I noticed Freya was actually considering his words, or seemed to be. She was looking at the floor, her eyes scanning as if she was reading something. Trevor started to stand, and I tensed, gun still in hand. I looked at her without turning my head and saw her nod slightly, telling me it was okay to let him get to his feet. I didn't like it, but I let him stand. I wanted to shoot the superior smug look right off his face. You were a good husband, when you were around. I wasn't around much, I know, and I'm sorry about that. My job, he stammered. Your job, she repeated. Your job as an FBI agent. Yes, and you know I couldn't tell you I was an agent, no matter how much I wanted to. But Ty, he could tell everyone that he's an agent. He gave me a cold stare, but spoke to Freya. It's Ty, now is it? He looked back to Freya. Ty's position in the Bureau isn't a top-secret one. He was right about that, although I was just realizing I had no idea why his position had to be kept a secret. His position as... What was his job? I suddenly had no idea what Trevor did for the FBI. Had I ever known? Why had it never occurred to me before? The question swam around in my head, and I suddenly felt a little woozy. Trevor noticed as I fought the tunnel vision. You okay, Riptide? He asked in a mocking tone of concern. Riptide? Why did he call me that? And why did it seem to open up a black hole in my brain? You remember what I do, don't you, buddy? What my job is at the FBI? Think hard. I tried to focus on what he was saying, but a voice in my head screamed, Don't listen. Freya turned to me. Ty, what's wrong? Nothing. I'm fine. He's just trying to manipulate you, Freya. Don't listen. I wasn't fine. The next thing I knew, the world went black.
You're listening to Big World Network.